3 years. That's how long I walked those hospital corridors without anyone knowing. Just another night nurse clocking in, clocking out. Nobody questioned why my hands stayed steady during the worst traumas, why I never lost my cool when the ER turned into pure chaos. That's how I wanted it. Then Dr. Okafor walked into the break room one Tuesday morning, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You're Colonel Maya Washington, aren't you?" The room went silent. Dead silent. My coworkers stared like I'd just materialized out of thin air, because the woman they knew, the quiet night shift nurse who kept to herself, had a past I'd buried deep. War zones, impossible choices, scars no uniform could cover. My name is Maya Washington. I'm 45. For the past 3 years, I've been a registered nurse at Detroit Mercy Hospital. To everyone here, I'm just Maya, reliable. The one who takes the worst shifts without complaint, who somehow knows what to do when everything's going sideways. I live alone in a studio apartment in Midtown, maybe a 10-minute walk from the hospital. My life? Quiet. Predictable. Wake up at 5:30, make coffee, head to work, come home, eat, read, sleep. No complications. No questions about who I was before Detroit. That Tuesday morning, I was finishing my shift paperwork when Dr. Okafor walked in. He ran the surgical department. We'd worked together dozens of times, but never really talked. He had this look on his face I couldn't quite place. Recognition mixed with disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured. "I need to ask you something. Are you Colonel Maya Washington? The Maya Washington who served in Afghanistan and Iraq?" My pen stopped moving. I felt every set of eyes turn toward me. Keisha, my colleague for 3 years, actually gasped out loud. I looked up. Dr. Okafor was holding a medical journal open to an article about battlefield trauma care. There in the corner was a photo from 12 years back. Me, in uniform, standing in a field hospital tent. The room suddenly felt like it was shrinking. 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility, crumbling. I could have denied it, could have said he was mistaken, but something in his eyes told me he already knew. "Yes," I said quietly. "That was me, long time ago." The silence that followed felt heavy, loaded with unspoken questions. Dr. Okafor nodded slowly, respect written across his face. "I thought so. I read about your work. What you did in Kandahar in 2013, that was extraordinary." Extraordinary wasn't how I felt. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt since leaving the military 4 years ago. "That was a different life," I managed. "I'm just a nurse now." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew nothing would ever be the same. By the end of that shift, the whispers had started. The quiet nurse had a secret. And secrets? They never stay buried. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, population barely scraping 200,000, the kind of place where everyone's in everyone else's business, where nothing changes fast. My father, Marcus Washington, came back from Vietnam different, quieter, with eyes that sometimes looked past you at things only he could see. He didn't talk about the war much, but late at night, I'd hear him pacing the house, unable to sleep. My mother, Lorraine, was a school nurse. She was our anchor, keeping the family steady when Dad's demons threatened to pull us under. I was the youngest of 3 kids. My brothers, Jamal and Darius, were the athletes, the popular ones. I was the quiet one, the bookworm who preferred the library to the basketball court. But I wasn't weak. Dad made sure of that. He taught me how to stay calm when pressure hits, how to think clearly when everyone else is losing it. "Maya," he'd say, "courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs doing even when you're terrified." I didn't get it then. I do now. When I was 17, sitting in my high school library, I found a book about Harriet Tubman, how she kept going back into slave territory to lead people to freedom, how she never lost anyone, how she refused to back down even when it was deadly dangerous. Something clicked that day. I wanted to do something that mattered, something bigger than myself. 6 months later, 3 days after my 18th birthday, I walked into the Army recruitment office in downtown Jackson. My mother cried. My father looked at me for a long time, then nodded once. He understood. I left for basic training summer of 2003, got assigned to the Army Nurse Corps after finishing my nursing degree on a military scholarship. By 23, I was on a transport headed to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. I remember looking out the window during descent, seeing those mountains and all that dust, realizing everything I thought I knew about nursing was about to get tested in ways I couldn't imagine. That's where my real education started, not in some classroom, but in a tent hospital where the wounded came in waves, where every decision meant life or death, where there was no time for hesitation. I became someone different in that desert, someone harder, someone who could make impossible choices and live with them. The heat in Afghanistan was nothing like Mississippi. It was suffocating, relentless, the kind of heat that made you dizzy if you stood still too long. Our field hospital was a series of tents on the edge of Bagram, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire, helicopters, constant. That rhythmic thumping became the soundtrack of my life there. 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when casualties flooded in. They'd arrive covered in dust and blood, eyes wide with shock and pain. My first week, I assisted in surgery on a young soldier who'd stepped on an IED. 19 years old, Private Jackson from Alabama. He talked about his girl back home while we worked on him, his voice getting weaker with each word. We lost him after 40 minutes. I went outside, behind the supply tent, and threw up. Then I washed my face, went back inside, and helped with the next patient. There was no time for grief, no time to process anything. You just kept moving. But I learned fast. How to control bleeding with next to nothing. How to triage when there were too many wounded and not enough hands. How to talk to soldiers who knew they were dying. How to hold their hands so they didn't feel alone in those final moments. How to lock away the emotions until later, to function on pure adrenaline and necessity. The senior staff noticed. Captain Rodriguez, the head nurse, pulled me aside after a particularly brutal shift. "You've got something special, Washington," she said. "You don't freeze. Most new nurses take months to develop that kind of composure. You've got it naturally." I didn't feel special. I felt numb, but I also felt useful. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Over the months, I earned a reputation, the calm one, the one who could handle anything. When things got chaotic, people looked to me. By my second deployment, I was leading triage during mass casualty events. By my third, I was training newer nurses. I was 26 years old and felt 40. The girl from Jackson, Mississippi, who'd been afraid of needles as a child, was now performing emergency procedures in a war zone without flinching. But with every life we saved, there were others we lost. Those losses accumulated like weight on your shoulders, weight that never quite goes away. You just learn to carry it better. The promotion came unexpectedly in 2009. Fourth deployment, 29 years old, first lieutenant. We were stationed at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous regions in the country. Small base, just a few hundred soldiers. Our medical facility was even smaller. 2 doctors, 3 nurses, limited supplies. We made do. That September morning started quiet. Then the radio crackled. A patrol had been ambushed 5 miles out. Multiple casualties, heavy fire. Helicopters couldn't get through because of enemy positions. Major Chen, our commanding medical officer, made the call immediately. "We're going out there. Washington, Rodriguez, you're with me." We loaded the mobile medical truck and drove out with an armed escort. Gunfire got louder as we approached. When we arrived, chaos. 3 vehicles destroyed. Soldiers scattered behind whatever cover they could find. Enemy fire coming from elevated positions in the hills. 8 men wounded, 2 critical. Major Chen started working on the worst case while Captain Rodriguez and I handled the others. Bullets hitting vehicles around us, kicking up dust. The sharp crack of gunfire, constant. I was wrapping a tourniquet on a soldier's leg when I saw Major Chen go down. A bullet had hit his shoulder. He was conscious but bleeding heavily, unable to continue. Rodriguez was already overwhelmed with 2 patients. I looked around, at the wounded, at the soldiers still fighting, at the impossible situation. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to take charge. So I did. Rodriguez, keep those 2 stable. I'm taking over triage. I moved to Major Chen, stabilized his wound, then assessed the other casualties, made the calls. Who needed immediate intervention? Who could wait? Who could be moved? Who was too unstable? I coordinated with the soldiers to create better defensive positions around the wounded, talked the helicopter pilot through a dangerous landing under fire. Somehow, impossibly, we got everyone out alive. Back at base, as they treated Major Chen, the base commander pulled me aside. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was a hard man, career military, not prone to praise. "What you did out there," he said, "that was leadership under fire. You saved that entire unit." 2 weeks later, I was promoted to captain and given a commendation. But more than that, I was given responsibility. I was now in charge of medical operations for the entire base. At 29 years old, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. That responsibility changed me in ways I'm still unpacking. The incident that defined my career happened on a cold November night in 2012. I was 32, now a major, stationed at Kandahar Airfield, 9 years in Afghanistan, on and off. I knew the rhythms of war, the patterns, the procedures, but nothing prepared me for that night. We got intelligence about a village 40 miles north where a school had been hit during fighting. Reports said dozens wounded, including many children. Problem was, the village sat in contested territory. Command deemed it too dangerous for a rescue operation. But I had the coordinates. I had the resources, and I had a Hippocratic oath that didn't distinguish between safe missions and dangerous ones. I went to Colonel Patterson, the base commander, and requested permission to take a medical team out. He refused. "It's too risky, Major. We don't have air superiority in that sector. I can't authorize it." I understood his position, but I also understood that children were bleeding out while we had this conversation. I did something I'd never done before. I went over his head, contacted a humanitarian aid organization already operating in the region, and arranged for their convoy to transport us. Technically, I was on leave for 48 hours. What I did on my personal time was my business. I took 3 volunteers, nurses and medics who believed in what we were doing, and we joined the aid convoy. We reached the village after sunrise. What we found was worse than reported. The school had taken a direct hit. 37 wounded, including 22 children. Some with injuries so severe I knew they wouldn't survive without immediate surgery. We worked for 14 hours straight. No breaks, no rest. Using whatever supplies the aid organization had, improvising when we ran out. We saved 28 lives that day. 9 didn't make it. When we returned to base, Colonel Patterson was waiting. So was a military police escort. I was placed under immediate investigation for disobeying orders, unauthorized absence, and reckless endangerment. The charges were serious enough to end my career and potentially result in court-martial. But something unexpected happened. Soldiers I'd served with for years started speaking up. Letters poured in from people I'd treated, people I'd trained, people who'd served alongside me. The humanitarian organization went public with the story. Suddenly, I wasn't just a disobedient officer. I was a symbol. The debate raged for months. Was I a hero who saved lives or a rogue officer who endangered her team? The truth? Probably both. The court-martial began in March 2013 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I sat in that military courtroom in my dress uniform facing a panel of 5 senior officers who would decide my fate. The charges were read: willful disobedience of a superior commissioned officer, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer. If convicted, I faced prison time and a dishonorable discharge. Everything I'd worked for, gone. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. I'd violated the chain of command, taken military personnel into a combat zone without authorization, risked lives for an unapproved mission. They weren't wrong. I'd done all those things, but what they left out was why. My defense attorney, Captain Lisa Mendez, was relentless. She brought in the 3 volunteers who came with me. Each testified they went willingly, understood the risks, believed it was the right thing to do. She brought in doctors who explained the medical necessity of immediate intervention for the types of injuries we treated. She brought in families of people we saved, including an Afghan mother who held up a photo of her 8-year-old daughter and said through a translator, "This woman is why my child is alive." The courtroom was packed every day. Active duty soldiers, veterans, civilians. The media covered it extensively. I became a polarizing figure. Some called me a hero. Others called me a dangerous maverick who thought the rules didn't apply to her. I didn't feel like either. I felt tired. On the 5th day, they called me to testify. The lead prosecutor, Major Williams, was aggressive. "Major Washington, you took an oath to follow orders. Why did you believe you were above that oath?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I took 2 oaths, sir. One to obey orders, one to do no harm. When those 2 oaths conflict, I choose saving lives. Every single time. Even if it means endangering your own people? My people volunteered. Those children didn't choose to be in a war zone." The questioning went on for hours. They tried to break me down, get me to admit I was wrong. But I wouldn't. Because I wasn't wrong, I might have broken protocol, but I hadn't broken my principles. After 3 weeks, the panel deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the head of the panel, a stern-looking colonel named Henderson, read the verdict. On the charge of willful disobedience, we find the defendant guilty. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the lives saved, we recommend leniency. I was given a formal reprimand, reduced in rank to captain temporarily, and ordered to complete additional leadership training. But I wasn't discharged. I could continue serving. As I left that courtroom, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, because I knew something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just an officer. I was controversial, and in the military, controversy is a burden you carry forever. After the court-martial, I was reassigned to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. It was 2013. 33 years old, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't in a war zone. The adjustment was harder than expected. Walter Reed was world-class, state-of-the-art equipment, plenty of staff, no bullets. But I felt restless. The pace was different. The stakes felt lower, even though logically I knew that wasn't true. The patients were often veterans dealing with war's aftermath, traumatic injuries, PTSD, rehabilitation. I understood them in ways many of the other medical staff didn't, because I'd been there. I'd seen what they'd seen. Over the next 4 years, I slowly rebuilt my reputation, developed trauma care protocols, trained new military nurses, worked with veterans. In 2015, I was promoted back to major. In 2017, promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a medical training battalion. And in 2019, at 39 years old, I was promoted to full colonel. The rank I'd once thought I'd never achieve. But something inside me had shifted. That drive that had pushed me through all those years, the fierce certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, it was fading. I was tired. Not physically, though the years had taken their toll, but emotionally, spiritually. I'd spent 21 years in the military, saved hundreds of lives, also made impossible choices, carried the weight of every person I couldn't save, sacrificed pieces of myself I wasn't sure I could ever get back. The nightmares started in 2018, not every night, but often enough. I'd wake up in my apartment near the base, heart racing, seeing faces I hadn't thought about in years. Private Jackson from my first week in Afghanistan, the children in that village school, the soldiers I'd triaged, choosing who got treated first, knowing that choice might mean someone else didn't make it. My therapist at Walter Reed said it was delayed PTSD, that I'd spent so many years in survival mode I never processed the trauma. Now that I was in a safer environment, it was all catching up. I didn't want medication, didn't want to be labeled as damaged, so I coped the way I always had, by working, staying busy, not thinking too much about what I'd been through. But in the quiet moments, alone in my apartment, I started wondering what came next. I was 41 years old. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to achieve in the military, but I wasn't happy, wasn't fulfilled, just tired. So I made a decision. January 2021, I submitted my retirement paperwork. After 23 years of service, I was leaving the military. Retirement was strange. For 2 decades, I'd worn a uniform every day, had a clear purpose, a defined role. Now I was just Maya Washington, civilian. I spent the first few months in limbo staying with my brother Jamal in Atlanta. He'd become a high school teacher, married with 2 kids. His life was normal, stable. Everything mine hadn't been. He tried to help, but he didn't really understand. How could he? He hadn't lived what I'd lived. April 2021, I decided I needed to start over completely. A place where nobody knew me, where I could just be another person, not Colonel Washington with her decorated service record and controversial past. I chose Detroit, almost at random, as far from Mississippi and D.C. as I could get without leaving the country. I rented a small studio in Midtown, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep. Then I applied for nursing positions at several hospitals, left my military rank off my resume, didn't mention combat experience or commendations or controversy, just listed my credentials: registered nurse, bachelor's degree in nursing, 20-plus years of experience. Detroit Mercy Hospital called within a week. The interview was straightforward. They needed experienced nurses for night shift. I told them I preferred nights, worked well under pressure, was reliable. All true. They hired me on the spot. My first shift was June 2021. Walking into that hospital in regular scrubs, no rank insignia, no military bearing, felt like wearing someone else's skin. But I adapted, learned the rhythms, the personalities, the procedures, kept my head down, did my work. My colleagues were friendly but not invasive. Keisha, another night shift nurse, became something close to a friend. We'd have coffee during breaks, talk about TV shows and weekend plans. She had no idea I'd spent the previous decade in war zones. Nobody did. For 3 years, I lived this quiet life. Went to work, came home, read books, took walks along the Detroit River, went to therapy once a week with a civilian counselor who specialized in veteran transitions. Didn't date, didn't socialize much outside work. I was healing, slowly, from wounds that weren't visible but ran deep. Detroit became my sanctuary. The music, the resilience, the anonymity. I could walk down the street and nobody knew my story. Nobody expected anything except that I show up for my shift and do my job. It was exactly what I needed. But peace? It's always temporary. You can run from your past, change your name, your city, your entire life. Eventually, your past finds you anyway. The morning Dr. Okafor asked me that question, everything changed. Within hours, the entire hospital seemed to know. The quiet night shift nurse was a retired Army colonel who'd served in combat for over a decade. The reactions were mixed. Some people were impressed, even awed. Younger nurses asked questions about what it was like, about the places I'd been. Some doctors, including Dr. Okafor, treated me with a new level of respect. But others were different. Karen, a day shift nurse I'd worked with occasionally, made a comment that stuck with me. "So you've been hiding this the whole time? What, you thought you were better than us?" It wasn't about being better. It was about being left alone. But I couldn't explain that without sounding defensive. The hospital administrator, Mrs. Evelyn Donovan, called me into her office 3 days after the revelation. She was in her 60s, efficient, no nonsense. "Maya, I want to be upfront with you. We did a background check when we hired you, but it was basic. Your military service was noted, but we had no idea about the extent of it. Why didn't you disclose that you were a colonel?" I met her eyes steadily. Because it wasn't relevant to the job I was applying for. I'm a nurse. That's what you needed. My rank doesn't make me better at starting IVs or monitoring vitals. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But now that it's out there, we've had some interest. The local news wants to do a story. The hospital board thinks it could be good publicity. The thought of being on the news, having my story told again, the controversy rehashed, it made my stomach turn. With all due respect, Mrs. Donovan, I'd prefer not to do that. I came here for a fresh start, not to relive the past. She looked disappointed, but didn't push. All right, but I do want to ask you something. Would you be willing to help train our emergency department staff? We've been looking to improve our trauma response protocols. With your experience, I hesitated. This was the line I'd been trying not to cross. Staying invisible meant not using my military expertise. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades training others to save lives, recognized the opportunity. Let me think about it, I said. Over the next few weeks, I watched how the hospital handled trauma cases. Detroit wasn't a war zone, but it had its share of violence. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, stabbings. I saw procedures that could be improved, protocols that could save minutes. And in emergency medicine, minutes mean lives. I also saw how my colleagues struggled with chaos. They were good nurses and doctors, but they hadn't been trained to work under the kind of pressure I'd experienced. They got flustered, made mistakes, second-guessed themselves. I could help them. The question was whether I wanted to, whether I was ready to step back into that role, leader, trainer, expert. Whether I was ready to stop hiding took me 2 months to decide. October 2024, I went back to Mrs. Donovan's office and told her I'd develop a trauma training program for the emergency department. The news spread quickly. Some staff were excited, others skeptical. During the first training session, I stood in front of 30 doctors, nurses, and paramedics. Wearing scrubs, not a uniform, but I felt the weight of my past settling back onto my shoulders. My name is Maya Washington, I began. Some of you know me as the night shift nurse. Some of you know I served in the military. What you need to know is that I spent 13 years treating combat casualties in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I'm not here to tell you war stories. I'm here to teach you how to stay calm, make fast decisions, and save lives when everything around you is falling apart. I taught them triage techniques I'd learned in field hospitals, how to assess multiple casualties simultaneously, how to prioritize based on survivability rather than severity, how to communicate clearly under stress, how to control your fear so it doesn't control you. The training was intense. Some people thrived, others struggled, but by the end of the 6-week program, I could see the difference. The emergency department was functioning more efficiently, response times improved. More importantly, the staff was more confident. Dr. Okafor approached me after one particularly difficult trauma case, where we saved a young man who'd been in a severe car accident. That could have gone very differently without your protocols, he said. You're making a real difference here, Maya. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I'd been trying to be someone I wasn't. The quiet, invisible nurse was never really me. It was a version of myself I created because I was afraid of scrutiny, questions, judgment, afraid that if people knew who I really was, they'd expect too much, or worse, they'd think the controversy defined me. But standing in that hospital, teaching others, seeing the impact of my experience, I understood something important. Both versions of me were real. The colonel who led soldiers in war zones and the nurse who preferred quiet night shifts were the same person. I didn't have to choose between them. I'm 45 years old now, still work at Detroit Mercy Hospital, still prefer night shift, but I also run the trauma training program, mentor younger nurses, consult on difficult cases, don't hide who I am anymore, but I also don't lead with it. My military service is part of my story, not the entire story. The nightmares still come sometimes. The weight of lives I couldn't save still presses on me in quiet moments, but I've learned to carry it better, to honor those losses by making sure I'm prepared for the next person who needs me. People ask me sometimes if I regret my decision to go to that village in 2012, if I'd do it differently, knowing what it cost me. I always tell them the truth. I'd do it again, because 28 people are alive who wouldn't be otherwise, and that matters more than my career, my reputation, or my comfort. I'm Maya Washington. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I'm a nurse at Detroit Mercy Hospital. Both of those things are equally true. I don't have to choose anymore. I get to be both. That's my story. Not just the dramatic moments or controversies, but the quiet evolution of a person learning to accept all the parts of herself. I don't hide who I was, but I also don't let it define who I am now. I'm Nurse Maya Washington, and yes, I was also Colonel Washington. Both saved lives. Both carry scars, and both believe that every life is worth fighting for. If you've ever felt torn between who you were and who you're becoming, I'd love to hear your story. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones within ourselves.